Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm delighted to have these three fierce warrior women on stage with me, and we're going to tease out this topic: can reviews of the CPTPP and the work of ITAG create a Tiriti-based space? So that's going to be a nuanced discussion, perhaps. Or it could be a slam dunk in the first 2 minutes. We'll see how we go. I'd just like to invite India to introduce herself, and Mihi, and we'll just come along our line before we kick in.
Hi, kia ora koutou. Huri hau no ngā takangunu rong mai wahine rangitāne, ko India Miro Logan-Riley hau. Kia ora mata. Lovely to have you in the building. My name is India. I come from Kahungunu, largely based between two little settlements, Moana and Waipato, but come from the Pātangata Valley originally. I'm the oldest of 5 children. They're the reason I do what I do. I have an academic background in archaeology, but got really distracted by climate change after experiencing the ways in which that was impacting back home. And so I've been in the climate space for nearly 10 years now, working with rangatahi Māori and Pacifica in campaigning and carving out spaces for our young people to come through. So that's looked like doing things like going to the UN climate change negotiations for several iterations. It's looked like supporting the social media, kaupapa, ihumata, and that kind of thing. So across lots of different spaces, the intersection between climate change and Indigenous rights. I currently work part-time as the climate justice organiser at an organisation called Action Station, and then work part-time as a community researcher for a rangatahi and housing research project out of Pūrangakura under the guidance and expertise of Jenny Lee Morgan and Ro Hoskins. Shout out to them and their kaupapa. And then of course on ngā kaihotu for ngā Toki Whakarururanga. And of course can't talk about that kaupapa without mihi to all of you who are in ngā Toki Whakarururanga and the incredible mahi that's gone in, the decades, the almost like hundreds of years that have gone in terms of the extension of the struggle, and the mentorship that has been offered and provided through that by the likes of Jane and Moana, Maui and Pizza. And just mihi to all of you for being a part of the journey, and for those of you who are here today as well to be a part of that kōrero. Bye.
Thank you, India. Thank you. Lovely to have you join us. Kia ora, Carrie.
Kia ora koutou. Ko Carrie Stoddart-Smith tōku ingoa, no ngāpahi me ngā te whātua hau. I'm a business owner, started during COVID to, I guess my whole point was I've always been passionate about trade since doing my Masters, and so I decided I was going to, rather than work for the Crown, which I did previously, I was going to contract myself back to them and charge them for it. Following that, I have been, I'm a board member as well, a pūkenga with Ngā Toki Whakarururanga, and I do some work with Ngāhiwi as well on Te Aratini, so hopefully we get to talk to you all about that as well over the next few days. And also I'm a founding member of the Board of Directors for the Global Centre of Indigenomics, which is led by Carol Ann Hilton, one of Canada's premier Indigenous economists. So it's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to digging into this topic with my colleagues here.
Kia ora, Carrie. Tania.
Ko te me tuatahi, ka nui te mihi ki te mana i te whenua, ngā marae, ngā hapu o Waikato tainui, tēnā koutou. He mihi whakawhitai ki ngā kaimahi, ngā kaiwhakahaere o tō tātou wānana. Tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou e hoa mā, tēnā koutou wahine mā, te taumato o tātou wāhana. Kia ora. Ko Tania Pouwhare a hau no ngai tūhoi. Engāre e noho au kei te tāmaki makaurau, e mahi ana au ki te kaunihira o tāmaki makaurau. So my name is Tania, and I am the General Manager of Social Innovation, and I'm based in Auckland Council, and our job is social and economic regeneration in South and West Auckland, and Māori in Pacifica in particular. Our job, I guess the best way to describe it, is to disrupt the economic inequality that's blighted our largest city and our largest concentrations of Māori and Pasifika in the country, and replace that with an economy of mana. So very much working at two levels of systems change, whilst also having to deliver tangible outcomes for our whānau, because they can't wait for incremental systems change. They need the change now. So that's our space, and my work has primarily been leading on the economic mahi, and in particular our work around public sector procurement, so the money we spend is public sector, and ensuring that Māori get a fair go, Māori-owned businesses, for example, get a fair go at being able to contract for that work, and to keep money circulating, make it sticky, keep it circulating in our communities rather than it leaking out, which is the story of South Auckland.
Yeah, props to South Auckland. I was just saying to Tania, I'm so thrilled she's got a job, even though her maniac mayor nearly knocked it on the head. That came out of my mouth, not hers. So your work with the Southern Initiative is built on that idea of an economy of mana, and it's very empowering for our local communities. It's really well thought of, and the networks that I've moved in, living wage, skills development, strengthening whānau, and I know you've looked at whether these kind of agreements that are being negotiated can support those ideas around social procurement, or to what extent they are barriers. Could you make some kind of, provide some insights into that?
So I've tended to focus on the least sexiest chapter of the agreement, which is the government procurement chapter. And I think, and when I'm talking about procurement, I'm talking about the way in which local councils and actually in this case it's central government and its agencies buys goods, services and works. So the point of that chapter is to make sure that there's consistency across parties and how governments do that. It's also about liberalising government procurement markets, and I think that's the first red flag. When have Māori ever benefited from deregulation or liberalisation of state apparatus? So the reason why I'm focused on this and why I think it's so important is because the public sector is such a big consumer in small economies like ours. So for example, the Auckland Council, which is a local body, we spend $3 billion a year just buying stuff. That's not the money we spend on our own stuff, it's this money we spend out in the market. Central government's like $50 or $60 billion a year. So, and we buy a lot of bread and butter stuff that our people are involved in. So for example, Ministry of Education is responsible for 15% of all construction in this country. So we have a huge market shaping role, and we can use that for positive or non-positive reasons. And so, why does that procurement chapter matter? And because it's quite procedural, it's pretty dry, and it's all about the don'ts of procurement. It's not really an enabling thing, it's making sure that everyone knows the don'ts, the rules, and about how sovereign states purchase the things that they need, from roads right through to digital technologies, the laptop that I work on at work, for example. Now, one of the rules in that chapter is that there are no offsets. There's some exceptions, for developing countries, and there's an exception around disabled people and prison labour and stuff like that. And what an offset is that it forbids a country from being able to build in domestic content into its procurements. So, and that includes domestic suppliers, so our own, and being able to do things that might improve the balance of payments in a particular procurement. And I think it's also interesting that the exception is around, one of them is around disabled people and one of them is around prison labour, which are the two population groups where you don't have to pay the minimum wage. Anyway, I'm just saying, I'm not, but those rules are there so that you can't treat someone less favourably, and these are not bad principles at all. You have to be non-discriminatory. You can't disguise things. You can't create unnecessary obstacles, and you can't circumnavigate stuff. So, those are reasonable things. So, but why does that matter to us? It matters to us because we've got a fledgling supplier diversity movement here in Aotearoa. So what that is the intentionally levelling the playing field so that our businesses get a fair go at being able to win those contracts. And it is not a quota, it is levelling the playing field. It's got an illustrious whakapapa. It comes from the civil rights movement. And they've been doing this in the States for 60 years. Australia does it as well, Canada too. And we have in this country a progressive procurement policy with targets. And that is the type of thing that is, is tricky to align with the procurement chapter. It can be. Why it matters for us is that our own government is a huge market. It's clear, right, that there has been discrimination in the way in which the public sector purchases goods, services and works. For example, 6% of all businesses in Tāmaki Makaurau are Māori owned, yet when we first set out on this journey 4 years ago, only 1/3 of our percent of our procurement spend was with Māori businesses, and they were in the bread and butter stuff that we buy. So there is an inherent discrimination that needs to be taken out of that system. And in saying that, that's those 6% of Māori businesses employ 14% of all Māori in Tāmaki. So we're getting such amazing bang for buck, and owning your own business is one of the few pathways left to mana motuhake, economic mana motuhake. It's the only place where we see income parity between Māori and non-Māori, is people who own their own businesses and employ others. We don't see that in employment. And also, Article 3, whilst we have enduring socioeconomic inequality, we will never realise Article 3. There is the treaty exception, but it would need some interpretation to get to, the point of being able to defend the progressive procurement policy. There are other exceptions around public health, etc. And there are thresholds. So the special drawing rights, so it's only procurements over a certain value that get caught in this agreement. So there are some, there is some leeway, but my concern is the protection of what we are trying to achieve here, the economic inclusion and equity, and what we don't need is to flog off that future opportunity. I'm also really cognizant of not flogging off our labour rights as well, because most of us are workers, right? So that's not in this agreement, but we must always be vigilant about that. So do agreements like this, does this agreement disable or enable? Is yet to be seen, it's yet to be tested, but I would always err on the side of caution and protection and preempting any potential unintended consequences.
So is your key concern around the potential undermining of progressive, what's the word? Procurement?
Yeah.
Because of this chapter? Our domestic sort of situation here being undermined.
Yeah, I think we would have to prove something like that would fit into the treaty exception, and like, why make things harder for ourselves? Why make more work? And it's fledgling. So we have a program called Amotai. It's an intermediary that connects buyers. We've got 1,600 Māori and Pasifika-owned businesses. They employ 22,000 people, mostly Māori and Pasifika, disproportionately wahine, and a quarter of them are under 25. Like, if we don't pull out every stop to nurture this industry, I'm just thinking about the argument about incrementalism. Inequality will travel far more quickly and far more deeply than incrementalism could ever hope to mitigate. So actually, we need all levers pulled, and we need them pulled like now with absolute urgency.
So could the Inclusive Trade Action Group make a difference? I mean, we know we're coming up to this, we're in this review thing, so could that make a difference by including that in their work?
Yes, I'm going to be hopeful and optimistic.
Yes.
And say that there's an opportunity there. And wouldn't it be amazing if we turned it around from having to, kind of be in protectionist mode to being in sick with opportunity, because it's worked so well. I think, that the overarching thing for me is that the mistake to think that these things are void of morals, that economics is somehow subjective and that, it just works itself out. So what might it look like if we translated, mana enhancing economy of mana tika pono mana motu hake into very, very tangible, meaningful actions that group was actively progressing.
Oh, right, well, I think if anyone can do that, it'll be you. No pressure. No, kia ora. Thank you very much. It was fascinating. Really appreciate that. Now, Carrie, back in 2016, you made some very critical submissions to the Select Committee on the TPPA. Since then, you've done quite a lot of work trying to create a trade-related space that not only empowers Māori, but also Indigenous peoples affected by these agreements. So, do your initial concerns about the TPPA, CPTPP, try and say that after a drink, eh? Do they still apply?
However, yeah, so 100% they still apply. The 3 points that I did make in there were that there was inadequate time to make submissions on the TPPA. I can't actually remember back to the time, but I feel like it was as little as a week.
It was short.
Yeah, it was very, very short. And this is a 4,000-page document that we were given after 40,000 of us walked up the street against this agreement, and then we were given such a short time. So I think the concern still stands, but maybe not so much necessarily in that context, but in now that we're in a position where, for instance, there's Ngāpuki, there's Te Taumata, and it's around access to the negotiating text and how much time we're given to input and respond to some of those documents. There's also the transparency issues on what we can talk to people about that's in those documents that also remain. But then the other part was also around the level of involvement of the treaty partner. And in that submission, I think that I had referred to it as hapu and iwi, and I take your point, Annette, from this morning, that hapu is in the treaty, and so that is what, who the treaty partner and how we need to be looking at that. And I think that's an important point, because I think not just in the trade space, but when you look across the public sector, they're all going out going, hey, we are engaging with the treaty partner. And it's like any Māori is the treaty partner to them.
Hello. Yes.
So it's just like, we need to have a conversation amongst us to say, how are we going to, talk about who the treaty partner is, and then saying that these might be some interested people who have expertise who could offer something to this conversation, but the mandate must go back to hapu. So there's that issue as well, and I think so there has been some progress in there. I mean, I think prior to CPTPP, there was engagement with FOMA and the iwi chairs, but there wasn't much more engagement kind of beyond that. So now with Ngā Tuki and Te Taumata set up, I think during APEC, they're reaching out to Māori Women's Development Inc., reaching out to Whāriki, and to a range of different stakeholders. That kind of, it made a difference. It's not nowhere near what we want, and it's certainly not enough. So that was kind of the second point that I made. And the last point I made was around the treaty exception clause, and it was a very uninformed, I must say, in terms of my criticism of it, because the criticism I have of it now is far worse than what it was then. And that is because I have the information from those who took that claim through the Y2522 claim, have read the report, and have also read like Amakura's assessment of that in the book that actually Rita Schwartz was an editor of, on Indigenous trade. So, I mean, I'm going to try and lay it out for you, because I don't think the parts have been laid out yet for it. But if I get it wrong, you need to go talk to Professor Jane Kelsey, and she'll correct anything that I got wrong.
Same.
But basically what it does is there are kind of three parts to it. The exception allows the Crown to take any measures it deems necessary. So that's a self-judging part that actually we like. To accord more favourable treatment to Māori, which is the part we don't like because it's limiting in scope, and I'll come back to why. And then it uses a chapo language, which is used in other exceptions in WTO law, which says as long as those measures aren't deemed under justifiable discrimination or an arbitrary restriction on trade. So the reason we don't like the more favourable treatment part is that while it's a defence for if the government implements something that's more favourable to Māori, it doesn't help if the government says, hey, we're not going to implement a thing, because if we do that thing, we breach the treaty. So we don't like that part in there, because it limits the scope of what we can use the exception to protect in terms of our rights. And we don't like the chapo language because it limits the policy space that we have. It allows the parties to that agreement to tell to complain to our government. And I think it's what you call the regulatory chill factor comes out from that chapo. So that is what was the three things that I said in there. What the government has done is at the WTO recently, it tabled a very strong Indigenous exception clause under the JSI, so Joint Statement Initiative on E-commerce, and that is reflective again of the work that the Y2522 claim brought, and raised those issues and taking it before the Waitangi Tribunal. So this exception removes the more favourable treatment language, and it removes the chapo language as well. It also, in that when New Zealand tabled some of that language, it tabled some specific carve-outs that also gave some extra kind of oomph, I've got no other word for it, for ensuring that the Treaty of Waitangi was seen as a legitimate public policy objective under New Zealand's system of law. So I think there has been some changes, but there's also been backward steps. It's like there can be language out here and we take it forward, but then we step back too often, and it's like we don't have the courage. And what we've heard up here today, everyone say, is we need the courage, and not just us Māori, the Crown need to have the courage as well, to stand up and go, we need you to agree with this, not because it's a nice thing to do, but because it's the right thing to do. And I think that's what needs to be being put forward in a more stronger tone. And I know that we heard, things have to happen incrementally, and I do understand that there are diplomatic relationships and these things are very challenging. But if the Crown were better at helping Māori forge engagements with these countries, with those political departments, not just when there's something on the table, but when, just as in general, to build that whanaungatanga so that we can take those people from hesitance to assistance, because we want them to help us to convince other people. And I think one of the biggest things that I saw that was really disappointing was when they dropped the ministerial-led Māori trade missions that TPK led, because those Māori trade missions, they weren't just about going out and getting commercial, commercially driven outcomes. And Ngāhiwi was a huge player in having those set up. They were also about forging political relationships, forging cultural relationships, and making sure that when things were going to get, perhaps there were going to be tensions because there were political sensitivities, we already had a relationship to lean back on because we were doing these engagements at a government level as Māori on a regular, consistent basis. So I'll just, just keep walking.
Fabulous. Thank you for that. Explaining that about the treaty exception clause, because that's always trotted out a lot as kind of like, yeah, we've got this, we've got that. But I was just thinking that when you were describing it, the first part about that treaty exception clause too is that the Crown determines on what issue it might, move things along. So there's an issue straight away there, isn't there? But how might the reviews of the CPTPP and the work program of the ITAG address things?
Well, I think there's a huge opportunity, like Tania was saying, with the ITAG, because what we know about the ITAG now is it's not just the CPTPP parties. So I think that's actually a good thing, because it means that we can look at, we've got IPETCA, of which Canada and New Zealand are party to, and there's an Indigenous aspect in that ITAG work program. So and actually IPETCA was intended to start in the margins of that, and then it just became part of APEC. But it's like, if we've got IPETCA as an open plurilateral, we've got the ITAG, which is now looking like an open plurilateral kind of agreement, then why aren't we bringing that under there, where we've already got 4 countries, who are signed up to that thing, and starting to build that momentum with those other parties? I mean, Mexico, Chile, Ecuador, and Costa Rica. I mean, why wouldn't we be trying to get them on board with the IPETCA to grow the IPETCA mandate for Indigenous people, and then use those parties to help us shape and get things through the CPTPP Commission? So I definitely think New Zealand and Canada need to work harder and stronger on the Indigenous side of things, and I think the ITAG is actually a really great place to start by bringing in those things that we already have agreements on. So even the Indigenous Collaboration Agreement between New Zealand and Canada, which was led by TPK, while that's an unresourced kind of arrangement at the moment, bringing all those things together within that ITAG context is actually a really smart way of going, hey, we're going to bring these things together and just grow the membership, because once we've got these friends and allies, we can take those relationships to other forums where, for instance, the WTO, where they're all members, and they might, start looking at how we convince members of the exceptions in the language that we want included in some of these new multilateral and joint statement initiatives. So I definitely see an opportunity there, and that's how we can start doing it. I think we start with the things we've got, don't try and create something new.
Kia ora, thank you, Carrie. Ngā mihi kia koe. Now, of course, there are some things that aren't mentioned in the CPTPP, and India, as a young climate activist and advocate, the CPTPP and the activities of ITAG can have a major impact on your future, and yet climate change isn't even mentioned in it, is it? CPTPP. For some reason, that seems to be that the states insisted on just having a vague commitment to cooperate with each other to transition to low emissions and that. So if you were to put 3 things on the agenda for the review of the CPTPP and for the work program of ITAG, what would those 3 things be?
Yeah, I think the first thing there is that obviously the exemption, or the leaving out, the negligence around the climate crisis and the agreement is quite intentional, actually, and I think that goes way, way back to, when colonization first arrived. It was about power and the accruing of resources, the stealing of land, the acquiring profit, and so doing things around addressing climate change would affect that ongoing accruing of profit for empire, and so it's yeah, it's a convenient thing to leave out climate change for the ongoing perpetration of that greed, basically, for colonial nation states. And so just mention climate, be the first one, but this is where it gets really frustrating, and this is where it gets hard in the different teams within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, is that there's a lot of inconsistency across language and I guess, standards that we end up signing on to. So there's much stronger language around climate change and the protection of Indigenous rights in the Paris Agreement, and we've signed on to that, or the Convention on Peoples with Disabilities, we've signed on to that, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The language is already there, and it just gets left out of these trade agreements, which then ends up enabling harm, as was spoken about. And so I think there's some consistency that's needed there, and you touched on some of the transparency struggles, and we know that within the climate negotiations at the UN level, that once the doors start closing and civil society isn't allowed to observe the negotiations anymore, that shady stuff starts happening, and people's well-being becomes the kind of political horse trading behind closed doors. And so countries can kind of get away with a lot more, and that's what the secrecy enables, essentially. And so I think then, of course, another thing to be mindful of within these free trade agreements is the investor-state dispute settlement process, ISDS, another acronym for the books. But basically, if New Zealand wants to do anything about climate change that's going to affect a company's profit that's overseas and they're in the free trade agreement, or their country's in the free trade agreement, they can take the New Zealand government to court, and the New Zealand government will be forced to step back on those climate policies. And I just think that's really frustrating and disgusting. And actually, the Crown does not have the legal power to convey sovereign statehood onto corporations, but through investor-state dispute settlement clauses, that's what they're doing. And in Te Tiriti, there's not any language, any legal powers conveyed to the Crown to be allowed to do that, to allow corporations to not be held accountable and to just act as if they're a nation state who can take other nation states to court. And that can't be allowed, and we saw that even with around the foreshore and seabed and the confiscation of that, and of course Uncle Moana Jackson talks about this, that at that time all companies were sniffing around wanting to do offshore oil drilling, and when we enable these corporations to have these legal powers, that usually there's an ulterior motive happening behind, and we're starting to see that rumble out now with deep sea mining and those kinds of agreements that are coming out. And so I would take investor-state dispute settlements out, because also that then impacts on Māori, on Hapu's ability to be able to say, hey, no, you can't come and do that in our backyard. And we saw that in Kahungunu as well. We had to actively sail out against them and issue an eviction notice saying, hey, you can't come here and look for oil. And then, of course, the bigger piece around Te Tiriti. And anything that's the overarching one is, that was a document set up to create, nurture, and maintain the well-being of people who lived here, and of the places here, and of the whare of ngā atua here. Right? And so anything that doesn't uphold Te Tiriti is a threat to that well-being of us and of the places we live in and that we love. And so I think it's really important to make sure that we utilise the superpower of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, because it is an incredible framework that we need to lean into in order to make sure that free trade agreement or international treaty or domestic policy, that our people get to be well into the future, and that's not just Māori, that's everyone who lives within these lands, as well as whānau who live overseas, who are also dealing with the impacts of climate change.
So, India, you talked about investor-state dispute. What's the other bit? Yes?
Settlements.
Oh, settlement, yeah.
I think.
ISDS. ISDS. Can you give an example of how that is being used overseas to kill off domestic policy around climate crisis?
Yeah, so basically the EU can't make progress towards its renewable energy targets by 2050 because of overhanging ISDS from previous agreements. And when we're dealing with a climate crisis right now, it doesn't make sense to hold on to those things. And then also in the case of the US as well, the same thing has come up. I can't remember the exact details, but you could definitely Google it. And I know that was a core fear in the TPPA negotiations, that so many people who took to the streets were really, really concerned because we could see the writing on the wall around climate change, that allowing fossil fuel companies to stop that would be really, really dangerous.
So as a campaigner at Action Station, one of your roles is to mobilise people, that'll be young people, Māori, Pākehā, everybody. What can we do to make the climate an issue for CPTPP?
Yeah, I think actually what was being spoken out about in terms of like working conditions and that kind of thing is an avenue through into talking about these trade issues. We're in a cost of living crisis, and that is because of, again, the profiteering by these corporations who are reporting record-breaking profits in the face of people living in their cars, which is disgusting. And so I think that's the way that we talk about it. And for me, the climate crisis, I didn't get involved because, yes, I love the landscapes that I grew up in, and they're in my bones and they're in my body, and they motivate me in everything in this. But also it was a human rights issue. There was an issue for our people losing our whenua all over again. You know, down the road from my mum's house, we lost the first house into the ocean in the 2000s. And so it was climate change, the extension of colonization, coming for our whenua all over again. And so that's why I got involved. And I think that's when we're talking about these conversations, is making them really tangible, making the impacts really tangible. And I know because we've got a very good comms teams in other parts of the trade space who would be very quick to say, here's how it will benefit you, but they're not going to be honest about actually here's how it's going to hurt you. And we know that these free trade agreements and the patterns of economics in these lands post-colonization have done harm. So we have to talk about what could happen, and not to fearmonger as well, but it's also a chance to plant seeds. And I know, again, of course, always Moana Jackson, we talk about that one of the greatest things that colonization never took from us was our imagination. And it's that being able to imagine economic systems, free trade agreements, multilateral relationships that foster well-being and support, rather than just saying, hey, you could get this little thing over here if you ignore all of this that you've had to compromise in order to get that. And so it's those conversations, and then as we move forward into election year, make sure you're ready to vote, make sure you're enrolled, make sure your whānau enrolled to vote, and be having these conversations. They're hard conversations. Like the Springbok tour and everything that erupted around that still like sits on people's hearts in this country. But it is important that we have these conversations and we do centre that well-being, because, like communities, worlds, people's lives are on the line with this kind of stuff.
It's interesting too, because, if I mention free trade agreements to people, then they zone out. So, it's like the phrase constitutional transformation, which is like so important to a lot of us here. It sounds very academic. We really need to find another more fabulous phrase. But it is sometimes about talking, particularly to young people, about the impact of free trade rules on their lives. That it's not just about selling fish or meat or whatever, but it can seriously undermine the climate, our domestic policy around climate, our cultural and intellectual traditional property, mātauranga. So are young people, do you think, attuned to it? There's a lot of priorities. A lot of people are balancing a lot of priorities. Some people are just struggling to feed their families. So how do you pitch that out there?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's social media and doing really good storytelling, and this is where our creatives are actually really, really important. And in the climate space, and like, no offense to the lawyers in the room or those who studied law, but the movement for a while has been filled with environmental scientists and lawyers, and there are certain ways in which we're still losing because of that. Because we need our artists and our filmmakers and our documentary makers and our storytellers saying, hey, this is what's going on. And I know we talked about bravery and young people being brave, but it is also that our older generations need to be willing to be wrong. And I know, I just said the word wrong.
Touchy subject.
And okay, and that's the thing is like that. We know, like Socrates said, oh, the young people, they're just lazy and they don't respect their elders and da-da-da-da. And that's thousands of years ago. This is an ongoing tension. It's not new. But it is that if we want our young people to be leaders, then we have to be willing to be challenged. And I know I'm aging out. I'm going to be youth adjacent soon, and I need to remind myself of this. Is that we have to be willing to be challenged and not just mentor young people into positions of leadership that is just about like, okay, well, I agree with your politics, so you can come through, and that kind of thing. These are tense, rumbling times, and what's hard is that the negative impacts are starting to really steamroll, and they're really manifesting in what our atua are presenting back to us, and that also means that we're having to learn and respond really quickly. And I know that we can get touchy around shifting political norms and morals, especially when our young people are just saying, and this, and this, and this, but actually they've had the time and capacity to think about this kind of stuff and to see to those further horizons when we're talking about waka. And that's the thing, that's the whole point of rangatahi is to then see beyond. And maybe there are some rules that get broken along the way and we have to be okay with that. Maybe there's some tensions that rumble around, but that's what we have wānanga for, that's what we have our discussions and our dinner tables for, is to be able to move through those tensions and those disagreements as well. And I will say again, if rangatahi are coming into these spaces, because I think like my generation, younger generation, so switched on. Like, will not settle for crumbs. Land back, absolutely. Economics needs to be transformed. And I love that. And I also want to shout out to those who are non-Māori who are stepping into that space as well. We have an incredible cohort of allies coming through who are staunch in that struggle as well. And it is that, with this switched onness, it's never just one rangatahi brought into a room. Always more than one, preferably more than 2, 3, 4. And we do have to be paid for our time. Rent, until we can transform to a point where we don't have to rely on the market to house and feed our people, then we've got to be paid in the meantime. And that it can be supported. It is hard to be called out by an auntie. We all have those stories, right? Growing up, there was that auntie who saw you do something wrong at the marae, and it was a smack. And oh my God, I remember my story, my learning curves. It's giving me stress already. But I think it's, being able to do that in ways that still maintain ongoing access and support. It's not like, I don't support you, so I'm not going to talk to you anymore, because that's actually really childish. But it is like that whanaungatanga basically, and really re-embracing that, because it is part of what Annette talked about with doing things our way and doing things as if we've already won, right? Because that carves out the spaces and the ways to be able to achieve mātiki mai without having to wait for the crown to do it. And so many other things I could say about the power of rangatahi, but I'll leave it at that for now.
You're neat. Kia ora, kia ora. Now, Ms. Tania, a question. Since Australia and Canada have carve-outs for Indigenous procurement, doesn't this context support the interpretation of the Treaty of Waitangi as a procurement exception?
Well, that's not explicit in our agreement. So it's actually Canada. So Canada is very clear in its schedule that Chapter 15, which is the procurement chapter, does not apply to its Aboriginal procurement policy, including a thing called set-asides. Set-asides is where you will take procurement, and it is only open to competition by, in this case, Indigenous businesses, for example. That's not in our one. Is it helpful? Yes. Would it be even more helpful if we had something explicit in our agreement? Yes. But I don't think we can rely on other people have got it, so therefore we're covered, and we need to ensure that this is absolutely protected, and the best way to do that is to have something concrete like what Canada's got. The Australian one is actually services for Indigenous people, so health, education, and also social and economic advancement. It's not necessarily Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island businesses.
Is it remotely possible to get regenerative business as a new foundation in the CPTPP?
Why not? Look, trade, enterprise, R&D, innovation, they all predate free market capitalism, right? This is not new. Marketplaces existed long before we had the type of economy that we live under now. Why not? It's a lack of imagination coupled with a lack of will, and then a huge number of vested interests that would prevent that from happening. And I don't see why it's not possible. We're not defying gravity. These are man-made systems, and I say man-made deliberately. Man-made systems, and they can be unmade. It's not the law of physics.
Kia ora. Thank you very much, you three fabulous women. Gee, you're neat. India, Carrie and Tania, really appreciate your kōrero. I'm sure everybody did. There are some papers out in the foyer near the Kai table. So those have got the analysis that Ngā Tuki Whakarururanga did around for the CPTPP and some other papers there that you would be encouraged to read. They provide a window and some kind of important capturing of the sort of kōrero that we've had in the last 3 sessions. So, yeah, thank you very much for your kōrero. Okay, well, I'll just try to think of a song that...
The audience can sing one.
Yeah. India, you want to step up?
The audience could.
I've got a voice that can cut glassy. Don't want to hear that.
She's a warrior woman and her work is never done. She's got her back for her people. She won't bow to no one. Got that look in her eyes. Know what you mean. She's a black pearl original, the girl of my dreams. Kia ora.
Kia ora.